Today we'll be talking about one of the very important and striking questions that confront with ourselves concerning the relationship between science and faith. Would it be complementary to each other or contradicting to each other? That itself is one of the challenging issues that led many people to be confused to a certain extent. And accordingly, the ideas of atheism may arise in this case because we could not have a comprehensive method to reconcile between faith and science. In particular, that when there are some new discoveries and we are unable to perceive it or to even to explain it within terms of faith. This is a problem which may ask us to widen our scope of understanding both definitions, because if we don't know the definition of each of them precisely, we will be unable to connect them, and consequently we will be leading to a misconception, enhancing the atheist to become in very good position. So, in order to be more realistic and looking for reconciliation between science and faith, for tackling all claims about atheism, we would like to apply the scientific method in order to visualize how these claims are really becoming falsified in terms of science once you are talking about something related to faith. Let me start talking about the basic definitions of both of them, and then we will discuss the problem in detail. Science and faith have different approaches for examining their contents, yet some glimpse of reconciliation between them is essentially to be mentioned explicitly. The problem of misconception is based on lack of determining the proper domain to explain each of them in a reliable way. So if we don't know the domain of our detection, we may be facing a real dilemma, as we have lack of measurements to estimate whether our claim is true or not. From this perspective, it is worth mentioning to revisit the previous definitions of faith and science to be complementary rather than contradictory to each other. By the way, let's know that the meaning of faith and science. Science is a way of thinking much more than it's a body of knowledge. This is the famous word by Carl Sagan. While when we talk about faith, is confidence or trust in a person or thing, deity, view in a doctrine or teachings of a religion. So there is a variety of detection from this part into that. And the goal of science is to find out connection between things, that linking between sub-nuclear to cosmos. And our intuition in science is infallible, and we are really willing to challenge all dogmas, and that is one of the essential issues in science. While in faith the problem is quite different. The faith demands us to accept things that are already received from our ancestors, and itself is a problem to keep people measuring something that is already built in some concepts and not to be falsified, because faith demands us to trust, while science demands us to be skeptic. So if you apply the scheme of skepticism in things that based on trusting, this itself becoming a blasphemy, as we call it in faith. And when you do the contrary, when you believe in theories in science without being skeptic, in that case you are no longer developing scientific issues, and there will be no development at all. From that point of view, it is wise enough to differentiate between their domains willingly, to know that there is a common ground, but this common ground does not have the same tool for detection. This is crystal clear to everybody. When we talk about atheism, and that is one of the themes that led people deny faith and relying it to scientific way of thinking, let me first find the pillars of that effect. I mean the effect of being an atheist. To become an atheist, it's not a way to apply skepticism between day and night, or to be after being a religious fellow, all of a sudden you became skeptic and change your way of thinking or detection and try to apply something that doesn't belong to your beliefs. I mean here beliefs, not something like theories. The problem that really entired in letting people to start becoming atheists is that essentially a psychological one. They had some incidents that altered their way of thinking or their life, especially that led by some people in their congregations per se, leading them to be stumbled. And they do not have a real sense of pastorhood. And that pastorhood lack of pastorhood led them to be unable to join their congregations. Accordingly, they have to get something different. They have to be completely strange with some ideas that could be counted to them a remarkable one. From this perspective, they went to claim about what we call it atheism. And atheism actually is divided into two parts. The first one is positive atheism, and the second is negative atheism. Positive atheism is a type of atheism that explicitly denying the existence of God by means of scientific method. Applying scientific method, they falsely figure out that God doesn't exist. And we would like to comment on such a claim like that, and this is the core of our debates. While the other one is negative atheism, includes that they have such a specific interaction in a way that they were expecting God to give them something and it doesn't match with their needs, then they made such an enmity to God. So they do not want him, they do not want to reconcile with him. Accordingly, they have such a kind of negative atheism. The fellow who is really willing to find something, he keeps on praying days and night and neglecting in his mind that when you want to start praying, you have to ask, number one, for the heavenly things rather than the terrestrial ones. So your order of requests should be assigned according to our Lord's message. That has to be the heavenly first, then the earthly or the terrestrial things. If we reverse this demand, then it doesn't match with God's request. This makes people to deny God because they do not want God to accept him as he looks like. They want to have their fictitious God. And their fictitious God is a fellow who obeys their orders. And this is an extremely contradiction to the principle of becoming God. Anyway, Let us start with scientific method, because this is one of the most stringent claims about scientists who deny the existence of God and his presence owing to scientific methods. But let us revisit scientific method, and from this perspective we will judge at the end, would they become a real thing? I mean, would they really becoming reliable claims about that or not, or they have such a flaw in perceiving a certain concept. The scientific method is centered on 3 questions, and with these questions we will establish our ways of thinking, asking why, offering an explanation, testing and explanation. We will study in detail the meaning of why, because why itself has to be assigned perfectly, because without mentioning the right why, you wouldn't be able to get into the proper conclusion or the good answer. Because if you don't know the right thing, the right question, how could you expect the right answer? Number 1. So, in order to estimate whether faith is contradict or complement with science, let us ask people who claim about denying the existence of God. Number 1, do you have a clear sense of what the relevant phenomenon is? Do you know what are you talking about? Why do you deny this concept prior to proposing such a scheme for that debate? Number 2, have you found a way to ensure that you haven't overlooked anything in the process of making your observation? Another thing, are you quite evident that you estimate everything and you haven't overlooked anything to make sure that God doesn't exist? Revise your question and try to think about it. What do you know for sure? What's based on fact and what on conjecture or assumption? So if you are really certain that God doesn't exist, on what basis do you figure out that? As a fact? Or do you know what it's meant by a fact in this case? Or being a conjecture or assumption? Then, have you considered any necessary comparative information? Finally, have our observations been contaminated by expectations or belief? These 5 questions will enable us to judge whether any observation is becoming reliable for testing or not. So before you say God exists or not, or you put God into temptation, and this itself is a blasphemy from religious point of view. However, as you are an atheist, you discard this word, forget about it. But let me say, number 1, do you know what is meant by God? Do you have a clear definition to clarify the meaning of God? An eternal God, a redeemer God, or not? Or you have some confused ideas. You know that God as judge. Do you know how could you estimate that? It's a question needs to be revised. The way of being, thinking whether God exists or not, may also center on the way in which we do not overlook something. Are you aware of all items that monitor the situation of being God? How to become God? I don't know. So if you don't know precisely, if you don't know how to create time, if you don't know how to master matter in time and space, once there are some theories in science, unfortunately, these theories are not really sufficient to establish every single point in space-time, or even to expect the forthcoming of these events. Nobody knows. Even in cosmology, that we are really fascinated with, we are relying cosmology to some models, but none of them may give rise to the real situation that will happen to the universe afterwards. We do not know. We have lack of information, especially at the very beginning after Big Bang, because matter was not really in a way to be tested using classical theories. So we have such a blurred ideas about it. Anyway, we have to revisit all of our thoughts. We have to think carefully when we talk about the existence of God. Existence of God, it's not a simple question to be answered. We have to use the 5 questions that I have mentioned and think about it in a reliable way, and when we answer it correctly, we can judge. Surely we will find out that God exists. Thank you.